Alrighty, yo, what is going on, everybody? It's your boy, Mr. DDG94 here, back with another reaction video. Today, we finna react to what happened to THQ. This should be an interesting video. Without further ado, let's get right into it.
And I'm fully rested. Let's discuss what went down with THQ. THQ, or Toy Headquarters, ironically started as a toy company in Agora Hills, California in the magical year known as 1990.
Damn.
Founded by one Brian Farrell, a well-liked fatherly figure to pretty much everyone that worked under him, THQ then added video games to their product line because they were getting pretty hot with the advent of 16-bit machines. So much so that they just dropped the whole toy making thing within just a year or two.
Damn.
It should be noted, however, especially for fans of this channel, that THQ didn't exactly get off on the right foot in the video game space, developing the likes of James Bond Jr., various Home Alone games that weren't worth melting with a blowtorch, and possibly, and most infamously of all, the SNES version of Pit Fighter. As the 90s wore on, though, THQ eventually started snapping up licenses people actually wanted to play video game adaptations of, such as Ren and Stimpy, Japanese-made wrestling games, and the occasional Disney property. Other licenses then came, like Rugrats, Scooby-Doo, Power Rangers, and many, many others, to the point where they could barely keep up with the demand, releasing dozens of offerings throughout the year. This fervent desire for more and more kid-focused content was noticed by Brian Farrell, who felt that with the rise of the Cartoon Network, along with Nickelodeon and Disney programming, that there would be no shortage of things to adapt and then sell. Because we all know what happens with the gravy train, it never ever stops. I mean, sure, the licenses cost a pretty penny, but that money would be saved elsewhere during the actual development, as smaller, cheaper studios would then be contracted to make them, and with unmovable release dates already set in stone. Quality of the actual game be damned. This kept building and building through the early and mid-2000s, with the company occasionally diversifying with 2 to 3 multi-million selling wrestling products per year, and rarer mature-rated titles like your Red Factions, your Evil Deads, or your Grim Peaks into the 41st century. Speaking of peaks, THQ very much did in 2007, where they released 4 to 10 video games per month, 100% owned 15 different development studios, and employed several thousand workers. So after the very profitable year that was 2007, it was then logically followed up by 2008 and the global financial crisis. This hit the world and the video game industry pretty hard, with everyone's stonks taking a shellacking, but eventually competitors like EA, Activision, and Nintendo all bounced back, with their stonks returning to whatever normal levels subhumans in suits deemed they should be. Curiously though, THQ was not among them, as their financials steadily started to slide with no light at the end of the tunnel. Why, you ask? Well, that's because in the years following the financial crisis, children, or more accurately their parents, looked to save money by opting not to purchase a $60 Cars or Marvel Superhero Squad title, and instead put their ragamuffins in front of a tablet or phone with a mindless but free touch-based title of little depth. Hell, I mean, they didn't care, they're kids. They're stupid. So, seemingly overnight, the market for licensed games, and specifically licensed games aimed at children, began to shrink and shrink and shrink. That's bad enough for a company that specialized in such markets, but was made even worse by the contracts typified by Brian Farrell's business strategy.
Yeah, I gotta admit, THQ should have definitely pivoted. They should have pivoted. They should have came out with their own Halo, Gears of War, Call of Duty-esque game to stay in the fold. I think they could have pulled it off if they did that. I honestly think they could have pulled that off if they did that, but I digress.
He favored long, multi-game deals that would include the initial adaptation of the first movie or TV show, its already planned sequels/seasons, and then various spin-offs in between. So even when THQ could see these titles were no longer flying off the shelves, they were still contractually obligated to make more, losing additional money each and every time because, again, some of these licenses weren't cheap, and they no longer sold enough to balance out those costs. Brian Farrell was then at a crossroads with a damned if you do and damned if you don't style choice. If they wanted to turn THQ around and continue to exist, they would need to either fully embrace the mobile market or go all in on developing their original IPs in addition to creating new ones. And of course, in typical what happened fashion, they chose to fully commit to neither. In the Polygon article, The Fall of THQ, several unnamed former employees revealed that pivoting to the mobile market simply wasn't viable, as they weren't set up to develop tiny games that back then were made by 2 to 4 people, when each of their studios employed hundreds. Of course, pushing their more Xbox 360 and PS3-centric IPs like Saints Row or 50 Cent blowing up an entire country was something they could do. Brian Farrell didn't want to give up on the E for everyone market, as he felt that mobile gaming was more or less a fad, and that the kids would once again return to the rainbows and unicorns of THQ gaming goodness.
But I'm afraid I've got some bad news.
What Farrell eventually decided to do was go with the moderate approach, splitting the company into 2 divisions, with one focusing on core games and one continuing into the endlessly swirling black hole that was the licensed kids market. Now, while many saw this as a reasonable move, especially early on, complications soon started to crop up. Not from outside the company, mind you, but rather within it. Danny Bilson, formerly of Electronic Arts, where he worked on such franchises as Medal of Honor, was primarily hired at this point to oversee this new core games division. But early on, he was also given a considerable amount of power across all their in-development titles, and he didn't waste any time in using it. That same Polygon article spoke to several former employees who observed Bilson ordering significant design changes to several games to increase their playability and appeal, which would then logically cause them to be delayed or go over budget. The intent here was to space out releases a little more and to give studios additional time to make higher quality experiences than THQ normally provided. This strategy was at odds with how things had been done before, but many within the company, especially in the core games division, felt Bilson was on the right track. This was also bolstered by his mandate that whenever a hot new AAA game came from one of their competitors, THQ employees should play a significant amount of them so they would know what they were up against and to stay informed on where trends were headed. This was a company policy that Brian Farrell personally didn't vibe with, putting very little time into each game before quitting and focusing on other business things. Despite the changes Bilson made, fundamentally, he felt that THQ was still rooted in a 90s and early 2000s mentality, which also affected how everything was set up and organized. When he spoke to Polygon for the fall of THQ, he explained how running the core games division was a challenge because outside of Volition, the vast majority of their wholly owned development houses only had experience working on licensed titles rather than all original ones. Things were then made even more difficult when the senior management above Bilson decided to close 5 of said studios in a cost-cutting measure, which meant he would need to find fresh concepts and pitches elsewhere. Thankfully, he made some headway in that area by picking up projects like Darksiders, Evolve, and Devil's Third, all of which I've covered in their own dedicated episodes, which should give you some indication on how they impacted THQ's bottom line and its chances for survival. The other problem with core games was previously THQ had never spent more than $10 million developing a single title, and that included the marketing. But if they truly wanted to make competitive AAA games, especially on 7th generation machines, they would need to spend more on development, like a lot more, and that was obviously a change they never really got the hang of. This then developed into an internal schism between both divisions, with the licensed kids half bitter that the majority of funding was going to the core division, with the core division likewise viewing them as a waste of resources and manpower. It's here where Brian Farrell surrounded himself with like-minded executives like Martin Good, whom he chose to directly run the kids division, leaving it to him to argue over another big contention between both divisions, which was the almighty release date. According to Dave Davis, another manager on the core division side, via that Polygon article, he and Bilson were constantly fighting with THQ's upper management on ship dates, which were usually adhered to by the kids division, but not so much the core one. That model, that mentality, it doesn't work. I mean, you look at the top grossing titles, the most highly regarded titles, and they shipped when they were great. And I don't mean endless development, because that's a recipe for disaster as well, but in the natural course of development, you look at a date you're targeting, and at a certain point in development, you get a very good sense of what it will take to make this game complete at the highest level. But things only got worse from there, as these two styles of game development were constantly clashing, and Brian Farrell really couldn't do much about it. I mean, he unleashed this inter-company war and wasn't really prepared on how to handle it if it went sideways. And on top of that, both sides committed their own independent blunders. So first, representing Team Core, we have the timeline that knows only war, Warhammer 40k Dark Millennium. This was a Bilson brainchild, who, after seeing the mammoth success of World of Warcraft, felt that a long-term MMO that could constantly generate money would become the backbone of the core division. And they didn't even need WoW's 10 million user player count either. Just 1 to 2 mil would be enough to keep it profitable. Many in the kids division, though, thought that this was a risky slash kind of insane move, as Dark Millennium started to rack up quite a huge development budget even early on. Now, in terms of it being risky, yeah, it was, as costs began to spin out of control, what with the amount of additional developers they would need to hire and the projected costs of server upkeep. Bilson realized mid-development it simply wouldn't break even, and thus Dark Millennium was banished to the perilous horrors of the warp.
That's crazy.
With millions having been wasted on a product that never came out.
That's crazy.
Of course, Team Kids had their own Dark Millennium with the infamous U-Draw tablet, a simple peripheral that came bundled with the Wii game U-Draw Studio, and also had compatibility with a few other later THQ titles. The Kids division was hopeful that its similarity to other successful Wii peripherals would make it a hit, but what they weren't prepared for was just how much. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you. The first-gen Wii version of the U-Draw tablet did well, really well, and because there was no specific license attached to it, THQ got to keep all the profits and charge a bit extra considering it was bundling a piece of plastic with the game. Interestingly enough, though, when it was initially greenlit for full development in 2008, it was actually Danny Bilson who gave the go-ahead when he had some more say earlier on. Now, the decision to then greenlight a second generation of the tablet for the Xbox 360 and PS3 falls entirely on Kids Division management. It's been stated that Bilson and others argued against this move, saying that the market simply wasn't there to support it, coupled with the fact that, at the time, Microsoft was heavily promoting the Xbox 360 to the mainstream via the always fun to crap on Kinect motion sensor. So for THQ to then suddenly charge $70 for a tablet at the exact same time as Microsoft was touting that the only controller you would ever need was your whole body, well, that was going to be counterproductive. And it was! This HD version of UDraw was an unmitigated disaster, selling incredibly dismally, and because it cost more to manufacture and ship, unsold stock, of which there was plenty, stabbed THQ that much more at a time when they were already bleeding out. This massive bumble was more or less the wake-up call the company needed to make drastic changes. So after much hemming and hawing, Brian Farrell did just that by deciding to sunset the Kids Division and to fully embrace their core IPs and develop new ones. A sequel to Darksiders was put into production, a Volition project with Guillermo del Toro named Insane, Assassin's Creed creator Patrice de
Problem is, it was too late by this point.
1666, which has only now just been resurrected, and even an ambitious co-op first-person shooter based on some upcoming Avengers movie, which would go on to kickstart some sort of cinematic universe. I don't know, doesn't matter. Now, try to be shocked when I tell you none of these projects went to plan. Darksiders 2 was rushed to completion just as rumblings began that THQ were on the verge of bankruptcy, like they literally had no money left to finish that game, so many areas were left barren with various corners cut just to get it shipped. Devil's Third was also not completed by the time THQ announced they were winding down their business, and of course the untold millions spent on a AAA Avengers game which resulted in no game. This began going down in 2012, a year where a very last minute move was made to save whatever they had left, and that last move was the hiring of Jason Rubin. For those not familiar, Rubin was one of the co-founders of Naughty Dog. For more on him, see my worst fighting game episode of Way of the Warrior. But his task here wasn't exactly to keep THQ afloat under its own power, but instead to gussy them up for prospective new owners. He would see what they had in development, streamline any problems he saw, and then try to sell everything to a private firm. And in this case, it was Clear Lake Capital Group, a Los Angeles-based company Rubin already had ties with. Of course, competing voices within THQ would only muddy the waters, so Brian Farrell let go of both Bilson and Davis, with Rubin now running the entire show. Now, as a reminder, THQ was once valued in 2007 at $2 billion, and by 2012, it had been reduced to $12 million. So when Clear Lake's offer of $60 million came in, many viewed it as a little bit of a lowball offer, specifically THQ's creditors, who are still owed lots of money. To better facilitate this deal, though, Jason and others felt filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy was the best, most logical move. But then a bankruptcy judge felt differently, citing various legal irregularities and determining that the sale to Clear Lake was not in the creditor's benefit, and thus sided with them.
Damn.
This essentially canceled the sale, which disappointed pretty much everyone, with many feeling that if it had gone through, that THQ, the old THQ at least, would still exist today. But instead, the presiding bankruptcy judge ordered that THQ sell all its individual assets, studios, and IPs separately to different buyers, and that's essentially where we are today. Some projects were resurrected under a few different publishers, many others were outright cancelled, while the majority fell to either Deep Silver or Nordic Games, with the latter adopting the THQ branding and were then later absorbed into the Embracer Group, one of the many villains of the current capitalist-infested wasteland we now all unfortunately find ourselves in. And not all of these surviving franchises have been, let's say, they handled well by their new owners. In fact, most of them haven't, and I've covered several of them already in their own videos. And while it is a good thing that many of them did at least survive THQ's death, you can't help but think that if that sale had gone through and the original THQ management and teams that made said games were retained, things could be a lot better than they are today. What started as an innocent venture to provide adaptations of licensed properties to the kids that enjoyed them eventually collapsed into a gang of vultures picking a corpse apart. But that's the reality of the often changing and always tumultuous games industry.
Yep. Too little, too late for THQ. They not the same company that they used to be. I think they should have gave up on the kids market a long time ago. Like I said, maybe start making games that fit in with the times, like a Halo, Gears of War type of game. You already got Saints Row, that's a fucking banger. Got WWE, so you got a yearly license you can eat off of. They kind of just need to stick in their bag, man. If they would have gave up on the kids department sooner than later, it's a good chance they probably would have been good. And then they just focus on making titles that just focus on making original content. That would have did wonders for them. And then maybe now and again do one tie-in if it makes sense. You know what I'm saying? Make one tie-in movie, you know, go out there, you know, maybe that Avengers game could have worked. You know what I'm saying? That Avengers game could have worked. It's instead they try to go for the live service Wars of Warcraft thingamajig, and that was a death sentence right there. Damn. Sad hood movie. But anyways, though, that's just gonna about do it for this one. RPTHQ, even though they come back, but it's like I said, it's not the same THQ. So yeah, RPTHQ, man, the old THQ, the one that gave us the classic wrestling games, the fire SpongeBob games, the car games. Remember Cars? Remember that game? That game was good. I ain't gonna hold you. They had a couple of Nickelodeon bangers too. For sure. But hey, it is what it is. But anyways, though, that's just gonna about do it for this one. I'll see y'all in the next video. Till then, this is